Hello, happy January, and welcome to Electronic Specifier Insights, the podcast for electronics engineers. I'm your guest host, Sheryl Miles. In today's episode, I speak with Ruth Gray, Director of Sales at Z2Data and founding member of Women in Electronics Europe. In this episode, Ruth and I look at how supply chain risk parallels gender imbalance. We discuss what the blind spots might be when it comes to keeping women in tech, the importance of sharing responsibility for ensuring a strong talent pipeline, how we can predict dropout in female talent before it happens, as well as discuss the importance of mentorship diversity and so much more. We hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get started. Great to have you here this morning. Firstly, just how are you?
Hi, Sheryl. Oh, I'm great, thanks. And thank you so much again for having me on the podcast today. It's always, such a genuine pleasure to catch up with you. So thank you so much for having me on. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you. And likewise, it's always a pleasure. I do love chatting to you. So it's great that you're on the show. So firstly, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sheryl. So I'm the Director of Sales at Z2Data in EMEA. I have around about 17 years experience in the industry, so focused on electronics and complex manufacturing. I've held roles in both manufacturing, distribution, and most recently supporting companies with supply chain risk challenges at Z2Data. I'm also very, very passionate about the benefits of diversity, and I'm one of the founding members of We United, formerly Women in Electronics in Europe. I know we'll come on to talk a little bit more about that organisation, but that does a lot to support talent at every stage of careers through mentorship, leadership development, and also a global community.
Lovely. And you mentioned that you work for Z2Data, a supply chain risk management company. So would you mind just introducing Z2Data to our listeners?
Yes, of course. So it's one of the most exciting companies I've ever had the privilege of working for. We are actually headquartered out in Silicon Valley in California. We've been in business for around about 10 years, and we have over 500 global customers, primarily in the complex manufacturing space. So therefore with complex supply chains, as you would imagine. Now, we've seen a significant increase in the types of risks and disruptions to our customers in the past, around about 5 to 10 years. And that landscape is changing very rapidly. So companies are having to take into account, let's say at a relatively high level, risks from a geopolitical perspective. So anything from tariffs, restrictions on raw materials, a very challenging overall global geopolitical situation right now. Also from a regulatory perspective, so regulations such as product compliance, wider sustainability and ESG topics, and finally disruptions. So anything that can impact a supply chain, from a strike to a natural disaster. So companies really need better tools, better data in order to be able to thrive in that really rapidly changing environment. So visibility is key, understanding your supply chain, understanding the risks. And Z2Data supports with a combination of data, of course, integrated software solutions, and also professional services to support companies with a wide variety of these challenges. So Z2 focuses in three core areas. The first would be supply chain risk. So as we mentioned, understanding your supply chain, understanding the sites within that supply chain, the suppliers themselves, from anything from financial risk, ESG risk, trade compliance factors. Then the second would be environmental compliance and sustainability program. Then finally, the traditional electronic supply chain solutions. So supporting companies with obsolescence risk, multi-sourcing strategies, and understanding the availability of their components within their supply chain. So I guess many of these risks really require a multi-functional and cross-departmental approach. So collaboration across the companies and across supply chains to incorporate a very proactive approach to supply chain risk management. So that's where Z2 really is quite unique. It's one platform with all of the data in one place, and the ability to manage and mitigate any risk within that supply chain, from let's say, a forced labour exposure, through to ESG legislation, through to traditional obsolescence monitoring, through to a natural disaster. And really what's wonderful is everything we do is very customer centric. So we really listen to the needs of our customers. And for me, being part of that journey with the customers really is a genuine pleasure.
That's fantastic, Ruth. Thank you. And yeah, as you say, with geopolitics at the moment and supply chain, I think it's essential companies like Z2Data exist to help other companies with that. You mentioned obviously the complex of supply chains, and this podcast is called the Women in Tech Supply Chain. So let's talk a bit about supply chain risk and gender imbalance. In supply chains, risk comes from blind spots. So, what are the blind spots when it comes to women entering or staying in tech, do you think?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Cheryl. And I would say, just like in supply chain risk management, as you mentioned, with gender imbalance, the biggest vulnerabilities are going to be there in those blind spots. So, where the leaders aren't looking. And it's quite easy to draw some very direct comparisons. So, I mentioned visibility is key. Just like with supply chain, visibility is key for understanding women in the tech industry and women's careers. So most companies don't have that visibility in the day-to-day barriers that women face. This could be something as obvious as pay gaps or access to networks and access to sponsorship, down to sort of smaller things that happen on a day-to-day basis, overlooked contributions, you have maybe non-inclusive team dynamics, and little microaggressions in the workplace culture. Those are invisible unless you intentionally begin to monitor them. Another would be single points of failure. So in supply chain, we talk about multi-sourcing. Z2Data supports manufacturers making sure they have multi-sources for a variety of different parts and suppliers. And it's the same with women in tech when we rely on one woman to represent all women or serve as the single role model. It's a real overdependence. And of course, that creates fragility, that creates burnout. And in my opinion, that often also leads to women not supporting other women when it's seen that perhaps there are a limited number of opportunities at a certain level. Then I think data, of course, Z2 at our core and at our foundations are a data company. We believe you have to have the right data in order to run a resilient supply chain. And yet many companies don't track these crucial basic metrics about their talent pipeline. So perhaps they have kind of more high level, obvious factors that they take into consideration. How many women do they have at certain levels and things like that? But then breaking down, okay, why aren't women applying for roles or promotions? Where are they dropping out in those hiring funnels? Why are they leaving mid-career? Are our promotions and performance scores equitable within our business? And again, exactly with supply chain, if you're not measuring that, you can't manage it. Then I would say relationships as well. So what supply chains rely on relationships, right? Relationships with the suppliers. And similarly, women often leave tech when the support structures are fragile. So I know we'll talk about mentoring in some more detail, but mentoring, return to work support after career breaks, and psychological safety are all crucial. That relationship building is fundamental. Um, then maybe I would say bottlenecks as well. So every supply chain is going to struggle when one stage becomes a bottleneck. And if we look at women in tech and women in electronics, the bottlenecks are very clear. That first entry level promotion to manager, technical leadership tracks, high visibility projects. How do we avoid those bottlenecks and support women through that area? And then finally, I would say unexamined assumptions that are often made within businesses. So supply chains within supply chain risk management, you're always going to validate the stability. You're not going to make assumptions about that supply chain. But we often see that there are lots of assumptions when it comes to women's progression within a business. Things like, okay, well, meritocracy is just going to work, or women are choosing to opt out or lean out, or there's a pipeline problem. It's nothing to do with our culture. And those untested assumptions really do create the blind spots that we just spoke about, and that can hide the real root causes. And then I guess the very final one I thought would be disruptions, right? We've talked about disruptions in a supply chain, natural disasters, and unexpected change to a regulation, for example. So you have to plan for disruptions amongst your employees as well. So returning after maternity leave or caregiving interruptions. And I think it's really important to note here, this is crucial for men too. We are in a society and in an economic situation where most couples, both parents, if they have children, have to go to work. Economically, more and more unlikely that one parent, either the man or woman, can choose to stay at home with the children. So you have to have that support structure in place. So I'd say if we're looking at blind spots, this isn't just a kind of an abstract idea. You can apply those same operational principles. So if you want to retain women in tech, you've got to have the visibility, you've got to have the data and the right systems in place. So the logic's actually really similar, right?
Fantastic. That's amazing. Yeah, and I completely agree. And I'm glad that you also picked up that this is not just about women, it's about men as well. It is a universal thing. So I know that we talk about women in tech, but it also includes men as well, because it takes everybody to work together to make things happen. So let's pick up then a bit about your point on points of failure. If we look at the representation of women as a supply chain, where would you say the greatest risk of disruption then lies? For example, what stage of a woman's career would you say sees the highest attrition?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. Now, I'd like to sort of start with some data around where we are right now. So, Women in Electronics, or We United, gather lots of data in this space. And so, globally, 55 to 60% of college graduates are women, and around 6 to 10% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. So, you're seeing a drop off at every stage. So, from entry level to manager to senior leadership and so forth, we're seeing a drop off at every stage. And in the electronics industry itself, 16 to 23% of women hold leadership roles globally. So, that's including interconnect, semiconductors, OEMs, and so forth. And interestingly, I was recently listening to an interview with Sheryl Sandberg, who's the former COO of Meta. And there was a McKinsey report in the US on women in the workplace. And it's amazing how few companies in that report are now prioritizing advancement for women. So this is the 11th year that they've run this report. And more than half of companies now no longer prioritize advancement for women. And of those, 21% say career advancement is low or no priority. So these are big companies that are participating in a large report like this. And this is leading to women leaning out as well. So I'll come on to some of the stats around leadership development training as well, but that really is huge. There was also a 2025 Lovelace report, so named after Ada Lovelace, by a guy called Oliver Wyman and We Are Tech Women. This was based on the UK market. So according to that report, 40 to 60,000 women are leaving the tech industry in the UK each year. And around about 19 to 30,000 of those are exiting the tech industry entirely. So around about 45%. And again, in the UK, not dissimilar to the global electronics market, around about 20 to 28% of the entire UK tech work. So to come on to the next section of your question around attrition, why are they leaving and what barriers are they facing? So most of the time, so generally women that have got around about 11 to 20 years experience, over 75% of those had said they'd waited more than 3 years for a promotion. 50% of women in senior brackets are earning below average pay, 50%. So that's enormous. Okay, and so now we understand the landscape a little bit more. Why are women leaving? So of those women in the UK report, in the UK Lovelace report, actually only 3% of the women cited caregiving or childcare as their primary reason for leaving. So this is not a huge factor in terms of the exodus, if you like.
Mm.
The reasons were structural. Around about 25% said They weren't getting the career advancement they wanted, 17% lack of recognition, 15% poor pay. And then we come into things like workplace culture, lack of support and role models. So this is systemic change that's required here. This really is huge. So where do we see this? First, early career, this is the biggest barrier, the leaky pipeline, if you want, quote unquote. This is where we see the biggest drop-off point. They tend to leave because of unwelcoming culture. They may be underestimated. They're not getting any mentors or sponsors within the organization or within the industry. They feel like they're the only woman in the room oftentimes. And they realize sometimes quickly that they're not being paid equally for what they're doing. So why is this section so important? So if you're going to want better representation at mid to senior levels, this is going to be the biggest impact, right? You've got to keep women in the first place. So that's where most of that occurs. Then the next is kind of mid-career. And this typically comes to around about, when you would be potentially moving up manager roles, senior roles. There's less promotions. They're being passed over for leadership tracks. A fascinating statistic here, which was part of the McKinsey report that's on women in the workplace, at that mid to senior level and moving into leadership roles, men are 70% more likely to be tapped up for leadership training. And companies will typically give men roles that they can then prove themselves for, but they'll expect women to have already done it before. So, of course, you can't prove that you can be a manager unless you're given the opportunity to be that manager. And you also see things like burnout at this stage. There's maybe not the opportunity for the high visibility projects. And this is the area where you often do have that work-life imbalance as well. And you do need those caregiving responsibilities. Women typically leave tech at this point for more inclusive companies, totally new industries. So really just looking outside of the industry. Then finally, the senior leadership area. This pipeline narrows sharply. We are seeing, as a result of companies not providing the right structure, the right equitable environment, we are seeing women at this point kind of lean out, not want to go to that next level. Often they see burnout from being the only woman in the room. They have very high levels of scrutiny at that level, and there's much less tolerance for mistakes compared to men. And at this stage, women often leave for startups, consultancy, and again, industries with better representation. So I guess in summary, there's 4 kind of exit points. That first, early career, mid-career promotion. Of course, things like caregiving come in there as well. And then that senior leadership. So this isn't just a little trickle or a few people leaving. It's a major exit. And those, as I mentioned, those causes are structural. This is systemic change, progression, pay, recognition. It's not a personal choice. And the highest risk is that early to mid-career. So we have to do something about that early stage.
Fantastic. Yeah. And it is really startling when you look at the stats and you look at the data and you see that women are generally thwarted at every rung of that ladder, and more so as they progress. And it's interesting that I was having a conversation with someone recently who was talking about how women also access information in the engineering industry in particular, and that it's more of a word of mouth kind of a peer kind of review. You ask someone who's more senior and they advise you, as opposed to I can just look online and find the information I need. So that kind of also creates a bit of bias in the industry as well, where men will generally choose someone who aligns with how they think, or
Yeah.
so it's just very interesting. And it's not, I'm not saying it's always conscious, so there's a lot of unconsciousness going on, but it is interesting when you look at the stats, just to see from that 55 to 60% trickling all the way down, and and still, like we said, getting thwarted at every level. So then, in your opinion, then, what would life cycle management for women's careers look like? And how can we predict obsolescence or drop out before it happens?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So obviously, if you want to try and predict obsolescence, we're going to have to take a proactive approach. So we can think of the career journey like a product life cycle. So we've got the design phase, then we move into maybe growth and maintenance and looking at longevity. So I guess even at a stage before that, that development stage, we have to be doing that at a really young age. So schools, colleges, university, promotions of STEM subjects. Although I do think it's important to note that you don't have to start off from a STEM subject to have a really cool career in tech. So a couple of the organisations I'm involved in, like We United and ION, which is an obsolescence organisation, those have links to universities and colleges to really kind of promote the industry within there. And I think the earlier that we can do that, the better, to really embed that in, that this is something for everybody. And then at that first entry stage, you've got to have the right, we've talked about how crucial that is. You have to have the right onboarding structure and mentorship, sponsorship, and really building that foundation. Then at the next stage, the right opportunities for promotions and high visibility project making. And I would say here, it's really important as businesses to create the right structure. Is it the types of questions that are being asked in interviews? Is it the type of feedback that's being given to employees? It's really important to make this equitable. And I know there is we'll come onto this in a little bit more detail, but there is a DEI backlash, if you like, sort of stemming from the US at the moment. And we don't want anything to be biased towards women necessarily. But Sheryl, you just mentioned again, we've got that 60% of college graduates, 5 to 10% of Fortune 500 CEOs. It is not exactly like this is favouring women at the moment. But we can see clearly the data shows this is not biased towards women. So we have to have that right structure throughout the full career life cycle, if you like. And then, also things like flexible work, returning to work programs, that kind of maintenance side of the product life cycle, if you like, ensuring those correct pathways to leadership. And then how would we predict that obsolescence? So you need to be finding those early warning signals before someone leaves. Have they got a lack of promotion? Are they being overlooked and so forth? And spot those risks early, have targeted support in place. And I would say here again, mentorship is so important, guidance, sponsorship. From a personal perspective, I started out in the industry, as I mentioned, 17 years ago, and in military and aerospace in the initial. So, nearly 20 years ago, that was even more male dominated. And I'd never seen a woman around me in a leadership role in that industry apart from HR. Genuinely, there had never been a woman above me in the chain of command until maybe 10 years ago, seven to 10 years ago. I started talking to female leaders, and I wish I'd had more of that exposure early on in my career. I think that's so important. So I guess the final thing there is treating talent with the same, foresight, visibility, and so forth as you would a high value product in that supply chain. You've got to be managing it through its life cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it does, transparency is really, really important as well for progression. But you need to know the points you need to be hitting and what you need to be doing, because if you don't know the direction you're supposed to be heading or what you're supposed to do to get there, then how can you hit those points and how can you argue a case for it? And it makes complete sense. And it's a responsibility of everyone, like companies, to put those in place to ensure that they're giving everyone a fair and equal opportunity. And I also love the fact that you said that, you don't have to have a STEM background to join the industry. And I think that's also really important to note. It's I've said it, many times, like, it is also a creative industry. So let's talk a bit about then the sort of responsibility of companies, because Z2Data's platform helps companies take a shared responsibility for their supply chains. So do we need a similar sense of shared responsibility for the talent pipeline?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a little around how the complex supply chain challenges that companies are facing do need that really business-wide approach. And just like in supply chains, talent pipelines are only going to work successfully when everyone takes shared responsibility. So one of the things we do at Z2 is support companies in understanding that real resilience isn't just owned by one team, it's a collective effort across, everything, procurement, engineering, operations, and so forth. Same principle is going to apply to keeping women in tech. It's at the moment, I believe too much responsibility sits with individuals. So women are expected to lean in, negotiate more, find mentors, and all navigating this kind of bias by themselves. But you'd never kind of expect a supply chain to do that, right? To fix itself through some individual heroics. You build systems, you build standards, and you have shared accountability. So what does that mean for businesses, and why is it important? So having that kind of shared responsibility means leaders having equitable hiring practices, managers being accountable for the culture and the allocation of work within their teams, companies measuring progression, and pay with transparency. So it's not just a side project for HR or a few passionate employees. This has to be organizational and systemic change. So when you really do apply that in the same way you would to a supply chain, apply that same rigor and shared ownership, you see real resilience. You can develop that system to become stronger, more diverse, and more innovative. And I think it's probably very important here to note, why is that important for companies? This has a huge impact on the bottom line. So there was a recent McKinsey report showing that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on their executive teams were 25% more likely to have above average profitability. And companies within the top quartile for ethnic and cultural diversity as well were 36% more likely to outperform. So the crucial thing here is building the best company you can and getting the best out of your employees. They're then having those more ethnically diverse, gender diverse, just inclusive, forward-thinking teams are far more likely to outperform. There was a study by the Boston Consulting Group as well that showed firms with more diversity on their management teams generated about 19% more revenue from innovation. So this isn't even just about a profit. This is, leadership diversity correlating directly to well-being, innovation, social impact. So all of those things are so important. It's not just short-term profits, it's long-term growth. This is a it's a tangible business advantage. This therefore needs shared organization-wide ownership of that talent pipeline. So yeah, your bottom line, your innovation, your capacity, your resilience, your ability to innovate in an industry that we're in. So the tech industry is leading with AI, leading with every modern technology. We have to have diversity in that, in those key spaces. And it's really interesting as well. So we talked a little bit about the fact that there is a bit of a pushback against DEI initiatives in the US and the number of companies that are cutting back or rebranding or deprioritizing. But conversely, in Europe, the regulatory environment is shifting the other way. So under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive of CSRD, most large companies are now having to disclose metrics on, a huge variety of things, but things including workforce diversity, gender pay gaps, and the representation within their organizations. So in Europe, there's a real structural and cultural incentive to be more accountable, be more transparent, and look at that sustainability and governance. So, and interestingly, I was talking to a senior leader at a large OEM. He was from the US, living in Europe, and has been for a few years. And with the DEI pushback in the US, he's having more and more conversations with women at his organization asking to move to Europe. So this is having a huge impact. And this is even for demotions, they were willing to move across. So what we're seeing, I guess, if we refer back to the McKinsey report and what Sheryl Sandberg noted, we are seeing women leaning out in the US in these companies where they don't have that support structure. And we're actually, I know, a little bit anecdotally, but we're also seeing women perhaps wanting to leave to be in an area where there is that emphasis on the talent pipeline and on the importance of diversity. So, that's huge.
It is ginormous. It is absolutely huge, and it's just. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking it doesn't, to me, it's my opinion, but it doesn't make sense. Like we're losing all these women over time. Businesses, by incorporating diverse ways of thinking, because if you're creating a product, you're creating it for different people, different cultures, different, so you need these lived experiences to help your team to create whatever it is that they're creating to do the best that they could possibly do.
Yes.
And then that
And in
lives,
AI, with the age of
yeah,
AI, this,
yeah,
we're
exactly.
going to program these these AI models, these to with a really narrow view of the world. This just
Yes.
it's as if, and when you look back and think, okay, more women get killed in car accidents because seatbelts aren't tested on women. The medical industry, when you
Uh,
look at the amount of tests on women, it's like less than 5% of spending on
yes.
women. So I don't know the specific figures there, but that's insane. And now we're bringing the same kind of approach into AI.
Yeah.
And I think it's so sad because we we seem to sort of go in waves. And at the moment, and like I say, if you look at the USDI backlash, these kind of feelings obviously never went away, right? We haven't kind of come through and got to full equality. These feelings are still there, and it's just, yeah, it seems to come and go in cycles, and
Yeah.
it's a shame because it is so vitally important, as you say.
It's important, like, just on so many levels. And so, well, let's talk about then, like, your mindset then, as if we're talking about that, how we feel about the industry and the way it's going at the moment in this wave. Because obviously you work in an industry that's focused on anticipating risk and building resilience. But has your own mindset towards your career or the tech industry as a whole changed over time? And if so, how do you sort of navigate challenges and opportunities differently now to what you did before?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. So I would say anecdotally, it feels to me that the industry is changing. I do feel that women coming into the industry now compared to when I did 17 years ago, or compared to when some friends of mine began their career in Silicon Valley in the 80s, we have seen huge shifts, right? And we've mentioned, I know there's waves and there's challenges, but it does feel like it is changing. But then I would also preface that with, when you look at the stats, they aren't good. I know we've talked about this multiple times now, but 56% of college graduates, 5% of women in leadership positions. In some of the areas of the electronics industry in particular, women in leadership positions has actually decreased. The stats on women in leadership positions has decreased in the last few years. So we're actually going backwards. I mean, that's crazy. So I'm very hopeful about the industry as a whole. You can come from any background into this industry. I have a journalism and French degree. I have great friends and mentors in the industry who have no college education or history degrees or drama. You can come from any background and have an incredibly rewarding career in this industry. I do think that it is still different and challenging for women. There are different barriers at every stage. And I would struggle to find any woman in the industry who would say that hasn't been the case. I think it really is. So there's a long way to go, but I do feel very hopeful. And then I guess around my career personally, I think when I probably started out in this industry in, you know, 20 or something, just out of university, I was probably very naive and more reactive. And I do wish I'd had an organization like We United earlier on. And I know when that organization was first founded in the US, that's why Jackie and Amy and Monica founded it, because they said, what do we wish we'd had when we started out to help us with this journey? And having that network of allies, male and female, and mentorship and support, I think is crucial. And we all have to play an active role. regardless of gender or culture or background, we have to play an active role in supporting women to want to stay in this industry. And yeah, and I guess from a personal career perspective, I'm definitely would say I'm more strategic now. And I guess it's important to find somewhere that you feel you can be your authentic self and really develop as a person.
Fantastic. And yeah, you mentioned We United, of which you're a founding member for the Europe chapter. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So let's talk a little bit more about mentorship, because I've been fortunate enough, obviously, to do the Reunited sponsored walk, which is how we met, and
yeah.
I've been to one of their leadership events, and they're absolutely fantastic, and you do come away feeling really really good and positive. I think they're brilliant. So yeah, let's talk a little bit then about mentorship, because in risk management, as you know, prevention is cheaper than repair. So does mentorship play that same role for keeping women in the tech industry?
Absolutely, absolutely. So mentorship is absolutely crucial. And I will, I guess, take a moment to talk a little bit more about We United. So as you say, we met on the We United sponsored walk in London. When I started working with Jackie Mattox and the team was around about COVID. So it must be what, 2020, 2019, something like that. And it was the Europe chapter then. We now have chapters in the UK, Ireland, Munich, France, the Netherlands. So it's expanding hugely. And I would say anyone that's listening that wants to know more, do find out more about that organization. It's very easy to get involved and it offers so much. The mentorship scheme in particular, I would, of course, the We United mentorship scheme is excellent. Mentorship in general is really crucial for keeping women in tech. So it just supports you through those twists and turns and maybe even provides opportunities, gives you the best way of learning from your mentor, or if you're the mentor, learning from the mentee, helping people navigate that career progression, making sure, if you're bringing in some sponsorship as well, making sure that you're getting access to those high visibility projects and just avoids that sense of isolation and having to tackle those challenges alone. And that really does contribute to that early attrition if they're having to face things like that alone. I think, and anecdotally, I had a friend of mine did engineering, started out at a UK aerospace and defence company, then after about 3 years went to work in HR because she just was, in an office full of men, didn't see anyone like. And I think if you have that, that coaching, confidence building, skill development, everything that comes with mentorship, and that can really help to retain women and kind of support not just women, any underrepresented professionals to grow and stay in the industry. And mentorship is a massive factor in this. So it then, and that, as you said, repair is is cheaper than replacements. You can keep those women in those roles. It's absolutely essential.
Absolutely. And I think it is important that, like you say, the mentorship, because it works both ways. And I think, you can learn just as much from mentees as you can from mentors. And also it helps you to feel that you're not alone, and you build a network and a support group. And I mean, I've never been mentored, but I presume friendships as well, so that it doesn't have to be all strictly professional. Once you move past that stage and you become friends, and then you've got someone that you can just unburden to, get out whatever is in your head from the day, and then carry on.
Yeah, and yeah, 100%. And someone that pushes you to think about things in a different way and pushes you, or for this, from a personal perspective, definitely as well. The mentors that I've had throughout my career have very much encouraged me to be brave, to take risks, to, just put yourself out there, lean in, go for it. And oftentimes we, as I think, as women, we can be more cautious. I know lots of people probably have heard this stat loads of times, but men will typically apply if they've got a relatively low percentage coverage of what's required in a role. Women will kind of go, "Oh, I've got 9 out of 10. Best work on that before I go for it." So somebody kind of pushing you to say, actually, I'm pretty sure you could do that. And just to look at things with a completely different perspective as well. And as you say, I think whether you are, if you, one thing I guess is women typically respond better to structured mentorship programs because they'll oftentimes miss out on that informal mentoring. And you learn so much. I mean, you learn so much in terms of leadership skills from being a mentor in any kind of program. But as you say, you could just have somebody who happens to know a lot more about one area of the industry or one different skill set, so many different things that just have those exciting conversations. And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's kind of as you were talking, I was thinking we were talking about transparency earlier, and how if the company's not transparent and then you haven't got these mechanisms in place for progression, or you don't know about them, and it's almost like if you have a mentor that's had a lived experience, they're kind of almost like your transparency monitor. Well, you should be here. Like, why aren't you here? Do you know what I mean? You should be relying on your mentor for that, but it kind of always acts as that. So.
Absolutely.
So finally, a final question for me then is, if you could design a dashboard for monitoring the health of the women in tech pipeline, what indicators would you track and what alerts would worry you the most?
I love this question, Cheryl, I have to say. So I think we would have to focus on visibility and predictive alerting, or signals, if you like, on our dashboard. So with Z2, we support companies with turning the data into actionable insights. And you've got to be looking at your early warning signs and making sure that this dashboard is going to give you something to action and something to really take on within the business. I guess the first thing, most companies are hopefully doing this already. Certainly all large companies will be. What's the representation at each stage, entry level, mid-career leadership roles? What's the pay gap, and so forth? Then, and I think diving into a little bit more deeper, where are women and men being promoted from in similar roles? Then diving into, who's getting those high impact projects, and then work out even how people are feeling. How are people engaged? So can you get some scores on engagement through surveys, feedback, things like that? We've talked about mentorship being so important. So who's got access to mentorship? Who's missing the support they need? Then finally, who's leaving? Where are people leaving by length of service, teams, roles, understanding where those are. And if possible, also looking at who's applying for roles as well. I'm another just story. I remember senior leadership saying to me, "Well, there's no women applying for this role." Well, you've got to work out why. You've got to really dig down into that. And then, well, I guess what would be the most worrying alerts? You've got to look at, are women consistently being overlooked? Is there kind of disengagement or low engagement from certain teams? Are you seeing high exit rates? Are you not seeing those mentors where needed? So I guess it's turning those invisible risks that we've spoken about, those blind spots, into visible metrics. So, you've got to act before there's a huge crisis and it's too late, just like in a supply chain. That dashboard can hopefully help you to be proactive, look at the bottlenecks, look at the inequities that really leads to that lost talent, if you like.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. Well, I have really enjoyed my conversation with you today, Ruth. It's been really informative, enlightening. Before we finish, Ruth, is there anything else that you would like to add for our listeners?
Yeah, so I think if there was one kind of final thought or piece of advice, if you like, given the pushback we're seeing in the US against DEI, it would be that now it's more important than ever to treat that as a shared responsibility. So for organizations to bring this up to a number one priority, embed this into your culture. We saw the stats on profitability. If you have an opportunity to make your company 25% more profitable, why wouldn't you do that? Don't leave it down to the individuals to navigate this bias. Work together as a company, proactively identify those risks. Mentorship programs, equitable promotion practices, and transparency on pay, transparency on progression. These are so, so important. And then for individuals, find those allies, find those tools, be intentional about your career, create the networks, get involved with organizations like We United, own your own journey, and really find your own place. Make sure you're working somewhere that aligns with your core values, where you can act with authenticity and really thrive.
I think that's so important. Thank you, Ruth. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
It's been wonderful talking to you, Shell. Thank you so much again for having me.
No, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Electronic Specifier Insights. Don't forget to subscribe to the series to keep up to date with our newest guests, and do share with fellow colleagues, friends and family who may be interested in the latest news from the electronics industry.